There are few names that hold for me the emotional power that Gilbert Keith Chesterton does. Literature is a form of happiness, said Borges, and perhaps no writer has given us as many happy hours as Chesterton. The author of Orthodoxy was an unusual man, immense, restless like the sun. The novelist and playwright Cosmo Hamilton, who opposed him in some of the public debates that made him famous throughout the United Kingdom, said of him that he was monstrous, gigantic, astonishing, deadly, delightful. Nothing like it has ever been done before, nor will anything similar ever be seen, heard, or felt again. In his 62 years of frenetic and happy life, Chesterton wrote about 4,000 essays, around 200 short stories, 5 novels, countless newspaper articles, some plays and travel chronicles, hundreds of poems, a book on Victorian literature, and another on the history of England. He also enjoyed writing biographies of notable figures and undertook the colossal task of turning the lives of Francis of Assisi, Thomas Aquinas, Robert Browning, William Blake, Geoffrey Chaucer, Charles Dickens, and Robert Louis Stevenson into literature. Chesterton's tireless pen produced around 100 books, all brimming with a vitality that continues to astonish both believers and non-believers alike. K Chesterton was a man who loved to debate. When his brother Cecil was born, one of his dearest friends until his death in World War I, a 5-year-old Gilbert was overjoyed as he would finally have someone to argue with. In the public arena, Chesterton crossed paths in various ways with figures of his time such as Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells, Bernard Shaw, or Bertrand Russell. And he also mingled with other notable figures like Henry James, William Yeats, or Winston Churchill. And although his combative temperament led him to attack all kinds of ideas from every point on the political or philosophical spectrum, he had the remarkable ability to turn his intellectual adversaries into close friends. Chesterton was a staunch defender of all kinds of causes, and perhaps one of the most talked about in his time was distributism, a socio-economic theory inspired by Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, a third way of economic organization, different from both capitalism and socialism, a utopia that sought to prevent social inequalities and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. In an era when coherence had almost completely disappeared, Chesterton was known as the apostle of common sense. He was unkempt and clumsy, and to try to hide it a bit, he wore a long cape and a wide-brimmed hat. His work as a journalist and writer of detective stories, as a lecturer and debater on philosophy, politics, and religion, his imposing figure and his booming laughter made him a cultural icon of early 20th century England. And he, who could have been sober, scholarly, and aristocratic, chose instead laughter, beer, and sausage. He took the risk of the harsh profession of the jester, the only one who, thanks to the affection of his audience, can speak the most terrible truths that no one else is allowed to say. Gilbert Keith Chesterton, GK to his friends, was born on May 29, 1874. He was baptized according to the Anglican rite and was raised in a Victorian middle-class family. Talking about the Victorian era seems to inevitably bring to mind the sluggishness and hypocrisy of the religious world, that stiff, cardboard-like society and the moralizing attitude that Lewis Carroll so often mocked in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Chesterton never denied the deep contradiction that existed within the strict Victorian morality. In fact, he said that those highly religious households had been the main ones responsible for the rise of atheism in England. However, the crucial point for understanding his childhood and many other things is not the hypocrisy of adults, but the innocence of children. In the wonderful land of childhood, Chesterton said, the pure light of wonder turned existence itself into a miracle. The eyes of childhood look at the world with enchantment and hope, with wonder, without boredom. Perhaps that is one of the lessons we read the least and need the most from those words of Jesus. Unless you become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Chesterton valued his childhood memories more than his countless books, his journalistic travels around the world, his friendships with many famous intellectuals, or his popularity. In fact, in his autobiography he wrote, "If someone says that I have based my social philosophy on a child's games, I am willing to bow my head in agreement and smile." The mark of childhood on his ethics and his way of understanding faith would be indelible. His father, a simple, present man who taught him to live in anticipation of surprise, prepared him in a special way to never stop seeing the world through a child's eyes. Chesterton's formal education was erratic, and his talent was not evident from the beginning. In fact, when he was 9 years old, his parents made inquiries to see if he might have some kind of developmental delay. For 3 years, he studied art because he wanted to devote himself to painting. Eventually, he gave up those aspirations and began his university studies, which he later also abandoned. His writings would always have an unforgettable visual quality, expressed in brief and powerful metaphors. That remarkable skill may be an echo of his failed career as an illustrator. As the years went by, Chesterton's early childhood became a path filled with anguish and despondency. In Orthodoxy, he admits that at age 12 he was somewhat pagan, and by 18 he had become completely agnostic. Growing up was, for him, a kind of spiritual suicide. His passage through adolescence and early youth was a daze, a state of confusion, a morbid parade along the abyss of a humanity abandoned to itself. If the innocence of childhood is the first important clue to understanding Chesterton, then this agony of youth is undoubtedly the second fundamental milestone. And this has a lot to do with the spirit of his time. We're talking about the era of Nietzsche's Übermensch, an anthropomorphic idol who, driven by insensitivity and a thirst for power, devours everything in his path. Nietzsche despised Christianity because it was the religion of the weak, a faith in which God's heart burned with mercy to embrace the flawed. Such weakness is incompatible with the arrogance of the Superman, who believes he has no limits, and therefore suppresses any emotion that might weaken his ability to conquer. This is also the era of the rise of Schopenhauer's skepticism, who said that we are destined to live in the worst of all possible worlds, a cold universe where pain is perpetual and there is no room for hope. A time when some Eastern ideas became fashionable in European academic circles. A time when the philosophical idealism of the late 19th century sought to escape from the industrialized world in the arms race. So it embraced solipsism, a doctrine that denies matter and glorifies one's own subjectivity. Meanwhile, social Darwinism justified the survival of the fittest, and positivism promised to banish all human sensitivity so that we could achieve the efficiency of machines. It was a bitter and arrogant era that, to the tune of Wagner's apocalyptic marches, foreshadowed the world wars and the Holocaust. The young Chesterton, swept up by the spirit of his time, plunged into a deep existential crisis. During that period, Chesterton experimented with spiritualism, Satanism, esoteric arts, and theosophy. He was filled with doubts and became cynical. The journey through this period introduced him to a Gothic universe, which would later become the very world he depicted in the Father Brown stories. Borges said that Chesterton knew the world of monsters so well that he could have been a master of the night like Poe, Baudelaire, or Kafka. What saved Chesterton from those nightmares was precisely the memory of his childhood. He could have drowned in darkness and meaninglessness, but he was rescued by a dream he had in his early childhood. His father carried a golden key and crossed a bridge to open the door to the world for him. That shining key was the beacon that showed him the way out of the swamp. At the end of his life, he would acknowledge that his father had been a symbol or an arrow, and that in reality, what had saved him was the God of the golden key. After having walked through the valley of the shadow of death, Chesterton returned to the home of his childhood, to wonder, to joy, and to common sense. When people asked him why he had embraced faith, his answer was, to be freed from my sins. That awareness of evil, painfully acquired during his adolescence and youth, became the springboard that propelled him in search of hope. From 1895 onward, he worked as a journalist on Fleet Street, the iconic London street that was the absolute center of the English press until the 1980s. There, he wrote about art, politics, religion, and any other topic that came to mind in newspapers such as the Daily News and the Illustrated London News. He continued publishing there for more than 30 years. It was probably that front row seat to the most popular ideas of his time that helped him distance himself from many opinions that quickly became uncritically accepted trends. His marriage in 1901 to Frances Bloch, a deeply Christian writer, doubled his sense of wonder and made the contradictions in that grown-up world even more evident. Chesterton said it was Frances who brought him to the foot of the cross. Her devotion to the scriptures, her tireless service in Sunday school and in caring for the needy filled his life with gratitude and humility. Together, they made a very efficient team. She was the one who organized his magnificent chaos, negotiated his contracts with publishers, managed his wallet, and planned his schedule. Chesterton lived in an era of polarized ideas that is very similar to our own, and he chose, in such a time, to be one of those rare characters who have the unusual distinction of being seen as oddballs by both sides of the debate. He was too conservative for the liberals and too liberal for the conservatives. In himself, he embodied that fascinating madness of representing two positions at the same time, or perhaps neither of them. By not being associated with either side, Chesterton earned the right to be a bridge. And this is another essential key to understanding his life and thought: paradox. For him, the human being was a strange creature wandering through a strange universe. The only way to solve such a riddle was with an equally strange answer. Chesterton believed a stereoscopic spiritual perspective was necessary, one that could see two different things at the same time. That paradoxical perception isn't absurd. Rather, it's the only way to perceive the three-dimensionality of the spiritual reality we inhabit. At the center of that strange universe, Chesterton encountered the Christian faith itself. Of all possible symbols, the one that represents the Christian faith is the most paradoxical. In his words, the cross is a four-legged animal, with one leg longer than the others. The conflict of two hostile lines with irreconcilable directions. For him, the Christian faith was the only key strange enough to unlock the lock of a universe more extravagant than any detective novel. Unlike other famous British writers like Oscar Wilde or George Bernard Shaw, paradox was not just a play on words for Chesterton. Paradox also did not mean moderation, lukewarmness, or shades of gray, but rather the complete coexistence of black and white. In a skeptical and cynical era, Chesterton played a very risky card, that of dogma. In The Ball and the Cross, a novel published in 1909, Chesterton wrote, "Christianity is always out of fashion because it is always sane. And all fashions are pleasant insanities." Our era idolizes novelty and prefers to embrace new lies rather than accept the relevance of old truths. For Chesterton, the Christian faith represented a bulwark of humanity against the irrationality of fashionable trends. Thus, he became a paradoxical knight who, from the urgency of England's most popular newspapers, loudly proclaimed a very old song. He said that rebels who never stop criticizing everything old are actually submissive slaves to novelty. That attitude has little to do with the rebellion of the saints. Rather, it is the capitulation of free thought in the face of peer pressure and the hegemony of the spirit of the age. Chesterton took pride in the outdated dogmas of his faith. As he wrote in his autobiography, "It is the heretical creeds that die, and only the reasonable dogmas live long enough to be called outdated." For him, believing and thinking were two parts of the same path to maturity. His most famous character, Father Brown, embodied precisely this worldview. He could easily reconcile the most critical rationality with the most willing faith. Chesterton recognized that one of the great problems of Western culture has been the utopia of absolute freedom, which has led us countless times into a labyrinth of absurdities and disappointments. In our arrogance, we have lost touch with what is real, which leads us to consider our own narratives as reality, even at the expense of reality itself. The Prince of Paradoxes used his stereoscopic vision to topple the sandcastles built by the prevailing skepticism among the intellectuals of his time. His writings relied on the paradoxical simplicity of common sense to expose the absurdities that only get attention because they are new. He realized that people who are too sophisticated are not too far from becoming sophists. They just have to lose a few letters in the process. 1908 was a restless year for Chesterton, who was already 34 years old. In that year of overflowing creativity, he published Orthodoxy, probably his most important theological work, and The Man Who Was Thursday, undoubtedly his most famous novel. Although he still had 28 years to live and countless books left to write, his philosophy beats with total clarity in Orthodoxy, a classic text of apologetics and Christian spirituality. The story of his unusual journey from skepticism to faith. The playwright Francisco Neva said that Orthodoxy is the most optimistic book of the 20th century, and the journalist and theologian Philip Johnsky confessed that if, besides the Bible, he could take one book to a desert island, he would undoubtedly take this one. Up to now, I have tried to outline the fundamental biographical strokes needed to understand Chesterton's philosophy, and especially the philosophy behind his fundamental theological work, Orthodoxy. First, the innocence that characterizes the marvelous land of childhood, then the anguish and meaninglessness that come hand in hand with the arrogant Superman, and finally the return home, the innocence regained. As he confessed in his autobiography, Orthodoxy represented for Chesterton a scheme of my own reasons for believing that the Christian doctrine, as summarized in the Apostles' Creed, would be a better critique of life than any of those I had criticized. Orthodoxy is innocence regained. It is rediscovering what had already been discovered. It is choosing to be at home after traveling around the world and returning to the starting point. Chesterton's philosophy is a powerful response to the skepticism that marked his youth and that continues to darken our world. If the prodigal son had to crawl through the mud to learn the value of his home, Chesterton had to come up against the irrationality of the rationalists and the contempt for humanity of the humanists in order to return to his father's arms. Chesterton claimed that life is the ultimate adventure and devoted himself like a detective of the spirit to solving the fundamental mysteries. He set out to discover, with fascination, the paradoxical twists and turns of existence. He couldn't stand the vain people who thought so highly of themselves that they despised the gift that is reality and preferred to spend their lives trying to impose their own ideas on the universe. Mariana Fazio coined the term philosophy of grateful wonder to describe GK's way of thinking. That way of looking at the world was born from the intuition of childhood, and also from the influence of authors like Robert Louis Stevenson, Robert Browning, Walt Whitman, and George MacDonald. Accepting things with gratitude is the fundamental core of Chesterton's life, thought, and faith. It's a feeling similar to the questions raised by Psalm 8 in the presence of the Creator. What are mere mortals that you are mindful of them? What are human beings that you care for them? Says the psalmist. Existence is an eccentric, incredible gift, and the right attitudes towards such a gift are wonder and gratitude. After having walked the paths of cynicism and despair, Chesterton realized that the goal of life is to dig until you find wonder. Compared to the nihilistic desert and the skeptical thirst, anything has the potential to be wonderful. For Chesterton, the supreme sin is a lack of gratitude. Ingratitude usually manifests itself in two equally inhumane ways. The despair of pessimists who let go of grace to cling more tightly to misery, and the arrogance of optimists who don't need to thank anyone because they expect everything from themselves. Chesterton's era, and ours as well, are guilty of both kinds of sin. And often, the distance between the two is shorter than it seems. To believe that we are entitled to the grace we've received, or that we are fools so unfortunate that we haven't received any grace at all, are both heresies rooted in one form or another in personal merit. People whose self-esteem is at rock bottom or sky high share the same ingratitude, and both paths usually end up, sooner or later, in a similar place. And the idea that nothing has meaning, that everything is random, that in reality nothing is truly good. Giovanni Papini said that Chesterton was responsible for discovering the joy of Christianity. For him, joy was the greatest secret of the Christian faith. One of the topics that has kept theologians awake throughout history is the problem of pain. Why do we suffer? Chesterton counters that question with another. Why do we enjoy ourselves? If there is no meaning in the universe, if everything is random and accidental, how do we justify all the good things that happen to us? And even more, what makes us think that we actually deserve anything? These questions are a very sharp critique of any notion of human rights that does not rest on grace. Chesterton suggests that if a person is truly grateful, their natural attitude will be to direct that gratitude towards someone. That's why he believed that true rationality leads us to a deep sense of gratitude toward the Creator. A life that never reaches a sense of wonder is a wasted life. On the contrary, a life that is filled with wonder and gratitude can say, like St. Francis of Assisi, brother sun, sister moon, brother wolf, and even sister death. All of life becomes a celebration when we see it as a gift. It was that humility that led Chesterton to say sister orthodoxy, to recognize that those ancient truths of faith were also an unearned grace, a gift as precious as bread, or the sun. To look down on the orthodoxy of simple faith because we think it's just an arbitrary limit on our individual or cultural autonomy would be like refusing a floating plank in the middle of a shipwreck just because it's painted a color we don't like. The adventure of existence loses its center without the wonder of the detective who uncovers an astonishing truth, without the joy of the child who boldly leaps into his mother's arms, or without the humility of those who have traveled the world and choose instead to embrace the wisdom of the ancient creed. Chesterton died on June 14, 1936, in Beaconsfield, shortly after finishing his autobiography at the age of 62. 14 years earlier, in 1922, he had been officially received into the Catholic Church. If the already immense life of this remarkable man had not been enough to astonish both friends and strangers, his conversion to Catholicism was the crowning touch. Chesterton himself is an ode to surprise. His autobiography is a long and incredibly entertaining journey through his life, and yet it remains an enigma. As an autobiography, it is erratic and imprecise, and by the end of the book, the main character of the story remains, to a large extent, a mystery. There are hardly any dates, no precise facts, nor juicy details about the behind-the-scenes of his massive literary output. On the contrary, there are broad reconstructions of complex internal processes, and it seems that he was more interested in the processes than in the events themselves. There is also a profusion of remarkable ideas and concepts, which clearly mattered more to him than precise facts. And there is also an endless list of proper names, and it's clear that he found the people he was able to debate with far more fascinating than the books he had published. His influence on political and philosophical thought, on literature, and on theological reflection is immense. His place in the popular imagination has been, despite everything, paradoxical, just like he was. He is at once an unknown name to a multitude of readers, especially among believers, while also being a cornerstone for understanding 20th century literature. A multitude of artists and intellectuals of all kinds have recognized and expressed gratitude for Chesterton's influence. The list could be much longer, but it includes figures such as Hemingway and Marshall McLuhan, Iron Maiden and Ingmar Bergman, Dorothy Day, Tolkien, Italo Calvino, Agatha Christie, Orson Welles, Graham Greene, Dorothy Sayers, T.S. Eliot, or Slavoj Žižek. It was Alfonso Reyes who instilled a passion for Chesterton in a boy 10 years younger, a poet who came from the ends of the earth, Jorge Luis Borges. Borges' fascination with Chesterton is well known. He called him my master, and on one occasion declared himself the most devoted of his readers. H.G. Wells is one of the fathers of science fiction, author of essential works such as The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds. Wells was also a sharp social critic and found in Chesterton his most intimate enemy. They met repeatedly on stage and took part in heated debates before the public, which generally continued in a more playful manner after the audience had left, in some London bar. In an act of argumentative humility, Wells once wrote that if he died and had to face the final judgment, which would mean his atheism had been a mistake, he was sure they would open the gates of heaven for him by showing that he had been a friend of K Chesterton. Chesterton's thought also infused coherence, courage, and deep humanity into the minds of some of the most important freedom fighters of the 20th century. Martin Luther King quoted him on more than one occasion. Reading the novel The Napoleon of Notting Hill inspired Michael Collins to fight for Ireland's independence. And Mahatma Gandhi regularly read Chesterton and acknowledged the influence of his thought in shaping the project that would eventually lead to India's independence. The most famous convert, thanks to Chesterton's writing, is undoubtedly C.S. Lewis, who discovered him under rather unusual circumstances, while he was recovering in a field hospital bed in France in 1918 after being wounded in one of the trenches of the First World War. At that time, Lewis was an atheist. After reading Chesterton, he realized that if he wanted to keep being a stubborn atheist, he needed to choose his reading material more carefully. Later on, reading another book by Chesterton, The Everlasting Man, published in 1925, led him to doubt his own doubts. It was, in his own words, a baptism of the intellect. Ronald Knox was the one who delivered the Requiem homily at his friend Chesterton's funeral in Westminster Cathedral. When he had to find words to say goodbye, Knox said that Chesterton had been a true prophet in an age full of false prophets. In this arrogant age we live in, which seems like a megalomaniac version of the era Chesterton lived through, his clarity and common sense are like a lifeboat on the verge of extinction. Everything solid vanishes into air, becomes liquid, ambiguous, flexible, except for our ego, of course, that remains untouchable. Rather than becoming immune to dogmas, what we've actually done is turn less universal and often much pettier issues into dogmas. Against the gloomy predictions of the pessimists and the grandiose projects of the optimists, orthodoxy remains news. Good news at that. Gilbert Keith Chesterton died more than 80 years ago. As with fine wines, the legacy he left behind grows richer and more intriguing as time goes by. With every new turn around the sun, it seems that his fervent mind, iconoclastic clarity, and childlike joy become ever more necessary and urgent. If today we are in the midst of a rediscovery of the work of that holy jester who wrote Orthodoxy, it is probably because his common sense, clarity, and innocence strike a deep chord in our convoluted and hazy era. Thank you very much.